We're honored to open the day with Joseph Lee, who is from Martha's Vineyard. He is of the island, as they say, and his new book, when did it come out? Oh, just 2.5 weeks ago, so it's very new. It's very exciting. Nothing More of This Land, being interviewed by Taylor Smalley, so thank you both for being here. Joseph is an award-winning Aquinnah Wampanoag journalist and author of Nothing More of This Land, Community Power and the Search for Indigenous Identity, which weaves personal narrative with investigative reporting to explore what it means to be Native today. A former Senior Indigenous Affairs Fellow at Grist and Margins Fellow at the Asian American Writers Workshop, his writing has appeared in The Guardian, Vox, and High Country News. And he teaches creative writing and holds an MFA from Columbia. Amazing. Taylor Smalley is a member of the Herring Pond Wampanoag tribe, and she's the education associate at the Martha's Vineyard Museum and the collection specialist and administrator for the Herring Pond Wampanoag Tribal Collections and Archival Committee. That was a lot in one sentence. Sorry about that. Please join me in welcoming both of them. I'm really, really excited for this session.
Is this on? Hello? Can we all hear me? Yeah? Good? All right. Thank you for those introductions. Thank you all for being here. Can you hear me better? Good. Yeah, please. Somebody in the back just wave to me because I tend to just end up doing this because I get so caught up. Thank you for being here today. This is my first time here at this festival. It's wonderful, beautifully organized, so thank you for inviting me. And I want to thank Joseph for being here today. And I'd really like to start by, for maybe those who haven't read the book, just kind of go through a summary of the book and maybe how the book's laid out, maybe a refresher for those who have read the book.
Yeah, thank you. Like I said, it's been out for less than 3 weeks, so I don't think most people except my family have read it so far. So there will not be a quiz at the end. But yeah, so the book starts with the story of the Aquinnah Wampanoag and my family and what it was like growing up in the tribe here, and some of the questions I had about our history, learning about these things in school, the first Thanksgiving, and knowing that wasn't the full story, but not really knowing what the full story actually was, and coming here to Aquinnah, staying at my grandparents' house, working in my parents' store, and going to tribal summer camp, and trying to figure out what it meant to be Wampanoag, what it meant to be from Martha's Vineyard. And so those are the questions that the book really begins with. And then it kind of goes back into some of our history, the history of the tribe getting federal recognition, history of the tribe in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, either right before I was born or sort of as I was growing up and, being a kid in tribal summer camp. And then as I have those questions and I'm trying to answer those questions, eventually I become a journalist and I'm, interviewing people from other tribes across the country and indigenous communities around the world. And I'm kind of discovering that they have a lot of the same questions. And, I always thought that, all these other natives, these other indigenous folks, they were sort of secure in who they were, and they never had those doubts or questions that I had. But you talk to people and you find out that they have the same questions, and they're dealing with these same challenges of land and what does it mean to be a community and how do we build our community. And so I go to Alaska and Oklahoma and California and the UN, and I interview indigenous people from all sorts of communities and tribes and nations and try to kind of work through these big questions that are all in the subtitle, community power and indigenous identity. And yeah, so that's sort of the broad scope of the book.
Thank you for that, yeah. How does it feel to be back home, essentially, back on the island? You've only been here a few days, and especially after the book now being out and being back home, how's it feeling? How are you feeling?
It feels good, and I mean, thank you to everybody for being here, and the response here at home has been very positive and very nice, and everybody's very supportive, and I think the best part is maybe just it feels kind of the same. Like I was here at the festival yesterday, I was on kind of the lunchtime panel, and we did the panel, and it was great, and signed some books, and met some people, and it was really nice, and then we went home, and we went to the beach, and we went clamming, and it was just like, regular kind of summer day, and it's nice to, that I can write the book and be able to, engage with people and talk about the ideas in it, but that the rest of it is kind of still the same, and so that's nice.
All right, yeah. And so you live in New York most of the year, all of the year, and you're a journalist, like you said. And so how has that switch been for you, writing something so personal, bringing that on, and what was the inspiration to make that shift? Because obviously we know journalism is a lot of interviewing and questions and research and a lot of that technical work versus maybe this personal piece that is digging deep. So what was that like for you?
Yeah, I get this question actually a lot from other journalists who are like, is it weird to bring yourself into it? You know, because journalists we're supposed to be unbiased and neutral and never really put yourself in the story. And I had kind of the opposite experience, because from the beginning, I was putting myself in the story. And because, like I was saying, I grew up wondering these things and trying to figure out who I was and who our community was. And that's kind of where I started from. And because of that, I wanted to learn more about Wampanoag history. And then eventually where that led me was, as I was doing this research, I was learning, like, I can learn about our tribe, but to fully learn the full picture of, you know, Indian country and Native experience in this country, you have to look at other tribes too. And so that's when I started doing journalism. And basically this was, you know, kind of in the middle of like 2020 and, you know, the depths of the pandemic. And so you couldn't go anywhere. And I was just like calling people, like finding people online, like, hey, can I call you and ask you about your tribe and your experience? And, you know, at that time people were at home and trying to do this and trying to figure out, like, can we have a Zoom meeting? Can we do language classes online? And I was taking a Wampanoag language class on Zoom, which was the first time that had happened. And so all these sort of things going around, and there's, you know, any natives in the audience may know there's this like giant like social distance powwow Facebook group that has like 600,000 members, and it got like kind of out of control, and like I don't really know what goes on in there anymore. But, you know, people were like trying to find these means of connecting when we couldn't anymore. And that was the time that I really started to realize, like, you know, I want to learn about my own community and learn more about our history. But to do that, I really need to go outside of the community. And so that's where the reporting came in. And, you know, I wanted to do as much of that as possible, but I also didn't want to lose the personal part of where I began, because I felt like it was important for me to kind of, you know, be fully transparent with, like, here's where I'm coming from, here's what I'm trying to do. And the other part of that is when I go and interview other Native folks, I always share my story, you know, as much as they want to hear. I try not to make it about myself, but they're very curious, like, what is it like to be a Native journalist? Where are you coming from? Tell me about your homeland. And I wanted to bring sort of those conversations into the book too, rather than, I think what happens in journalism a lot is, like, you don't see that. You know, people are having those conversations, but all you get is like the straight reporting. And I wanted to make sure that I was including that full sort of context and conversation.
Yeah. And through that too, and talking to other tribal communities around the country, you definitely, I feel like it's inevitable to place yourself there as well. And I appreciate that about the book. It's funny too, being a mixed Native and then reading the book, and I guess a mixed person in general, you're constantly looking for that validation, or even that connection, of what it means. And so I want to ask you, like, throughout your travels, is there something that, because you share a lot of that in the book, and you share a lot about meeting different people, lots of different conversations, lots of parallels, but is there something that you, or I guess an experience that you had in another tribal community that didn't quite make the book but still influenced your journey through identity and this process that you're going through?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, when we were kind of preparing for the conversation, we talked a lot about this. And so in many ways, I wrote the book for people like us who, you know, are mixed and trying to figure out, like, what does it mean to be Wampanoag, but all these other things, and how do you kind of balance that? And can you be all of those, or you have to pick? And those were the conversations when I met other people from other tribes that I was most interested in. And I tried to put everybody that I talked to and everybody that I visited with in the book, because I didn't want to, you know, take the gift of someone's time and then, like, your story was kind of like, I'll leave it out. You know, and so everybody I tried to make sure that I at least included, but naturally, you know, everybody can't get like 5 chapters. And so I included everybody, but there's a lot of these extended conversations that kind of didn't get to make it in. And, some of the examples of what you're talking about, this sort of mixed identity, there's one chapter where I go to the Klamath River out in Northern California, Southern Oregon. This was right before the Klamath River dams were coming down. And now 4 of those dams have come down. And so we did this reporting trip right before to talk to tribes and farmers and ranchers in the area. And one of the guys that I met was this Karuk firefighter, and he's Karuk in Japanese, and I'm also Japanese and native. And I saw him, and I was like, I'm talking to you. And I kind of just went up to him, and I asked the question that I think I get annoyed when people ask hey man, what are you? I'm looking at you, can you tell me about that? And one of the things that was so interesting about our conversation is he's out there working, fighting fires on his homeland, protecting his homeland from fire, but also working in the Karuk tradition of prescribed fire and cultural fire. And he grew up with his mom, burning grass to make baskets, and they're trying to bring fire back to the landscape. And to me, this is he's sort of, he's living it, right? He's working the land, he's using tradition, but he's actually not enrolled in the tribe because his blood quantum isn't high enough. And it's something that he said when he was younger. He was actually he was bullied by other kids in the tribe for being mixed and for not fitting in. And that made him kind of want to withdraw and not be engaged. And he's I just want to he went to college in San Francisco. He's I'm just going to leave and do something else. And then eventually he came back and he got the job working with fire. And he was okay, this is my way of engaging with the tribe and with our traditions. And I don't need sort of that maybe external or political validation of what it means to be native. He had to find his own way of working with the land. And so his experiences like that I mentioned that in the book, but I there's just never enough space to get the full, I just wish, we talked for hours, and I wish I could just give you the full transcript of it.
Of course, thank you. Yeah, thank you for that. And playing on land back is something that you mention a lot. And it's something that we hear a lot. And as Native people, it's a very broad term, I guess, and it covers lots from not only literally getting land back, but sometimes it means keeping land and keeping it for the next generation. And you can't help to, I guess, after reading this and then living here on the island, knowing about the new opening of the Squibnocket North and South Pond trails, located on Moshup Trail and State Road in Aquinnah, formerly the part of the Jackie Onassis property, but it was also formerly a part of something else. Maybe can you give the audience something, your connection to the land, and with the book coming out now and that trail being public, how has that impacted you? Have you thought about that at all, and it being public and your relationship to the land?
Yeah, I'll start just briefly with a general on land back. Land back is really complicated because land is complicated, and land means so much, and it's not just ownership. There's, ancestral, cultural, spiritual, historical ties to the land, and that all means so much. And, to reduce that to we're just rebuying this piece of land or it's being donated back to the tribe, I think, it kind of glosses over all of that. On the other hand, I think I've seen something happen, maybe less now, but, maybe in the past 5 or so years, this thing where I think non-native people get kind of scared when they hear land back because it's I have land, you want it back, and what are we going to do about that? And because of that, I think some natives have, tried to not back off from it a little bit, but explain the nuances. Land back can be cultural, it can mean all these things. And I think it's important to say that it can mean all of those things, but if the land is not back, the land is not back, right? And so there are all these other ways, and in the book I talk a little bit about co-management agreements, for example, where there's a national park or a conservation area or something, and the tribe is kind of invited in to have a representative on the board. And I think that's very nice. I would not say that's land back, right? That's participating in the land in a way that they weren't able to 20 years ago, but it's not the tribe having full ownership, full control, full decision-making authority over that land. And so I think to come back to the island, we see that a lot with conservation, right? And conservation is a big thing on the island, and the new Squibnocket property We were actually, the authors, we were all invited to like do a tour of the thing on Friday.
I was going to ask you if you were planning on going.
Yeah, I didn't make the tour. Some of the other authors were like, "Can you tell me about that?" You know, and so it's in the book, and what you're talking about, the sort of complicated land history with that piece of property, which I won't go into the whole thing. You know, it's
please
in the
don't, please don't. Just little.
Yeah. It's in the book, but basically, I think it's just an example of, you know, the Kennedy Onassis family acquiring this piece of land, and it led to sort of this protracted battle with our family and the tribe over the land. And to this day, I would say that's still happening with these conservation pieces and questions of ownership and who gets to make decisions. And I think it's just a good illustration of the complexity of land, but also, again, this issue of like, if the land is not back in the hands of the tribe, it's not back in the hands of the tribe. And there's no way around that. And there are other things you can do that are positive, but there's no equivalent to that, I think.
Very, very well said. And with the land ownership that the tribe has, they own a little bit of the land, especially up in Aquinnah, the shops being one of them.
We don't own that
well,
land.
Sorry.
The town owns the...
Yes, apologies. The shops themselves run by tribal folks. Thank you for correcting me there. Which I think is a beautiful representation of what Aquinnah, it means to be in Aquinnah, especially going up there and seeing the community. And you talk a lot about growing up in the shop. I'm going to have a little plug here. Hat Marcha Gifts, Aquinnah, up at the circle.
The owners maybe right over here.
Sorry, had to. But I want to kind of focus in on that a little bit. And I know you talk a lot about the name. You've referenced the name and what that means. And it's, family members' names kind of mashed together. And that's beautiful even in itself. But I think if you look a little deeper and you look at those individuals and where they come from, you explore your Chinese, Japanese, and Wampanoag culture. And so throughout writing this book, my question is, because I personally experienced this, when you're exploring a certain part of yourself, it's almost like when you have multiple dogs or kids and you're giving love to that one dog and you look over and the other two are like... And so did you have any sort of like, I guess for lack of a better word, like identity guilt in a way, whereas like you're spending so much time in depth with your Wampanoag identity and then it's kind of you look over and you have the other parts of you. Was there any struggle to equally include or give a good base understanding of that for you while writing this?
Yeah, 100%. And there's a chapter in the book where I it's throughout the book, but there's one chapter in particular where I talk about my family's different background, the Chinese and Japanese sides. And it was important for me to include that for that reason, because I think I used to feel like these are all separate things. And in some ways they are, because, you're going to tribal summer camp. You're not going to, Japanese summer camp, right? But when I go to tribal summer camp, I'm going there as all of who I am. And I can't, just go there as, the native part of me is going there, and then the Asian part is, hanging out somewhere else. It doesn't work like that. And it's also interesting you bring up the store, because in many ways that's where I spent the most time here. My parents would be like, you didn't work that much. But I'm like, I spent a lot of time up there. And, I'm up there and it's very public facing. And so people come in and they're learning about the tribe and they maybe don't know about it. And then they're like, who's this Asian guy? And so, yeah, that was all part of the experience. And in many ways, like I was saying with the Silas, the Karuk firefighter who I met, where he was sort of acting out his native identity was, in the forest fighting fires. And where I was kind of acting it out was up at the cliffs in the store and, talking to customers. And that was always this thing, because I knew, even though I'm interested in being Wampanoag and learning about it and writing about it, it's I'm not perceived in the world that way. And I think there's a lot happening there. I think, people don't see native identity as complex. Most of us don't look like what they think we look like. And that's true for Wampanoags, and I think true for most tribes, to be honest. And that's something that I tried to sort of deal with in the book. And yeah, I always felt like, am I giving enough time to this, enough time to this? And what I try to do, and where I tried in the book and sort of personally, is arrive at a place where it's like, it's all there and it's all okay. And there are going to naturally be times where one kind of like bubbles up a little bit more, like here we are, we're up here as, Wampanoags, we're doing this, but then maybe we go and do something else, and maybe the other parts of who we are kind of like, okay, that's coming up a little bit more. And I try to embrace that more now, and like not try to force like, oh, but I need to feel like, this way here, and try to just accept that that's all sort of part of the whole thing.
So through that, what conversations do you hope that readers have after kind of reading and being able to reflect off of it? What do you hope that people are getting out of this book?
I think it depends on who it is. I mean, I think for, people like us and anybody, whether Native or not, who's kind of mixed or dealing with these questions of identity, I hope it offers something in that way, and people can work through these questions. And I tried to write in a way that's like working through it rather than me like dictating like, here's what it has to be. And returning to sort of a basic level, I would consider this a advanced audience, because, you all know the island and the tribe, but a lot of people don't. And so I do hope that people who aren't familiar with these things and maybe know Martha's Vineyard pick up the book and they're like, oh, I've heard about that place and I don't know anything about it except like presidents or whatever. And then they'll pick up this and maybe learn something about it, and learn about the tribe, and learn about the complexity of the island and our community. But then I guess for people who do have a little familiarity, I hope it sparks some more questions and conversations about the tribe. And I think we're talked a lot about, on the island, people know the tribe, or in history, like I mentioned, like the Mayflower and these things, Thanksgiving. But there's not a lot of clarity and specificity about who we are and how our community works and how we got here and our land and all of these things. And hopefully this will provide a little bit of information about that. But I think more importantly, kind of, spark those deeper conversations and add some nuance to what it means to be Native and what it means to be Wampanoag and our role on the island and who we are as a people.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Again, just going back to relating to the whole thing, just being away from home and finding that identity. And so I want to dive into, I'm losing all my papers. Can we take a second to, I guess, explore or I guess, how do I want to word this? Your experiences traveling. I'm going to go back again, traveling. And I want to ask you too, I guess, being a journalist, how has it been being like interviewed in the hot spot all the time? Like, of course, you're always opposite. This is a personal, curious question. Obviously, being the one asking the questions. How has that been for you, being like in the spotlight?
I think it's strange, definitely. I think it's a good experience for journalists to be interviewed, because every time I do it, I'm like, I cannot believe I make people do this all the time, and people are so nice about it and so cool, and I'm here like I don't know what to say. And in journalism too, one of the things is journalists, I think, tend to be very strict of, especially with maybe more like community regular people, they're a little bit more generous. Sometimes good journalists are, I think, but especially dealing with like elected officials or representatives from a company or something, you have to be really strict of like, no, you cannot read the story before it comes out. You cannot make changes. Like if you're on the record, you're on the record. And of course, like every time I do an interview, I'm like, can I change what I said? Like I didn't mean that, can I take that back? And it's very humbling. And so I think it's a good experience, but it is strange. And I think, there's a certain level of, discomfort with it as a journalist. Like you go out and you tell the story and it's not about you. You're just the person, you're like the vehicle for the story. And obviously in this book, I am the vehicle for some of these stories, but some of those stories are also my stories. And it's something I wrestled with too, of like how much of myself to put in the book. And I tried hopefully to kind of strike a balance of like, there's enough there that you see my perspective and you see like why I'm doing these things, but also hopefully the other individual stories kind of shine through as well.
And I wanted to play on that and ask about the title of the book. What inspired you to name it that? And I know names are obviously important in all cultures, and especially in our indigenous cultures. Our names mean everything. They dictate kind of how we walk and who we are and who we associate with even. And so why the choice of nothing more of this land, community power, and the search for Indigenous identity? Why not just call it like my journey to finding out I'm Wampanoag, or something different?
I definitely didn't want to do that. I feel like that's that's too much like my story, and so nothing more of this land is a phrase from this document written by one of our old leaders. It's called Mitarch's Will, and it's hundreds of years old, and there's actually kind of a contested history around the authorship of it, which I think is really interesting because it's part of this whole story of like it's never been this simple, clear narrative. There's always been questions and doubts and challenges from whatever angle. But the will is essentially talking about our land and saying, don't sell it, don't lose it, and if you do, the rest of the quote is kind of like, and he shall fall and have nothing more of this land. So that's kind of the full quote, and I just found that very powerful and kind of haunting and like this message passed down as a reminder of what the land means to us as a people, and that like there's no us without the land, and maybe there's no land without the us. And when I read that, it just I couldn't get it out of my head, and then when I'm having to come up with a title for the book, it just felt like the perfect thing. And to me it also captured some of the ambiguity and like nuance and complexity of what this whole thing is. It didn't feel right to have a title that was very like clear and declarative in a way, even though I do feel like this is sort of firm and declarative, but you're not totally sure in what direction all the time, and I really like that about it. And the subtitle, honestly, that was my publisher was kind of like, we gotta like nothing more of this land, like you gotta say something, and like we gotta give the people something here that they can like grab onto. And interestingly, one of the questions was, should we have Martha's Vineyard in the subtitle? And they were kind of like, no, I don't think so, because then it might be too specific. This is like, publishing inside baseball, that they're like, then anybody who doesn't care about Martha's Vineyard like won't want it. But so that's a question that we thought a lot about too, and it relates to the book, because I think it's a question of like, well, how much is this the story of Martha's Vineyard? How much is it, to your question, to my my story? How much of this is sort of an indigenous story? And I'm hopeful that it's kind of all of those things, but not necessarily any one more than the other. And so that's kind of the balance we were trying to strike in the title and subtitle. And then the other piece in publishing, is the inside, the flap copy here. So that's where it talks about Martha's Vineyard. And so hopefully we're kind of trying to hit all of those points in all of those little pieces that you have.
And even the name Martha's Vineyard, obviously, if you're from here or visited here, you know that it's referred to as Nopi to the people who are from here, but has been given the name Martha's Vineyard over the years. And I'm going to go back to your travels when you go to the UN. In your book, you talk about this. It's a 2-week Indigenous gathering in New York. I don't want to give too much away. But you meet a man named Kotaro, who is a Indigenous Okinawan man. And he talks a lot about language and identity. And I wanted to ask you, why is language so important to identity? And how does that help you kind of shape your own identity?
Yeah, so I met this guy. He's from Okinawa, and he's a PhD candidate at the University of Hawaii, I think. And he's working on recovering the Okinawan language, Uchinaguchi. And it's a language that, in Japan, they say that the people from Okinawa are not indigenous. They're like, we're one Japan, we're all Japanese, you're not the same. Even though what they did was very similar to what happened here, is they would go and say those people are like uncivilized drunks, they're lesser. They would make them wear signs that like identified who they were. And there's this very like degrading thing. But now they're like, we're all the same. We're all Japanese. Like your language is just a dialect of Japanese, even though it's not. And what's interesting is he grew up, people may know in Okinawa that they have a big issue with U.S. military bases. Like a massive percentage of the land is just U.S. military bases that Japan sort of welcomes in. And, it's this sort of Pacific military relationship. A lot has to do with China and the Taiwan situation. And so he grew up, this guy that I met at the UN, he grew up kind of coming up as like an anti-US based activist. And he thought that like going out and protesting the bases and calling out the abuses of the US government, whether it's environmental, cultural, all these things, like that was the only way to resist, right? And he always saw language as like, well, why am I going to waste my time with the language when like there's the base right there that I need to be protesting? And then he moved to Hawaii and went to school there. And, you know, people will probably know in Hawaii, they have a huge like language, culture thing going on, bringing it back, making it part of, you know, everyday life. And he learned from them that there's no way to separate the two. It's not like culture and protests and all these things over here, and then language is something else you can do on the side. He learned how linked they are. And he gave me all these examples. And the very quick one in the book is, you know, he says that learning about the language is learning about the culture. And in their language, they don't say my mother, they say our mother, because the mother is like a mother for the community. And so there are all these examples where as he's learning the language, he's learning about who they are as a people. And I think the same is true for our language. If you study our language, you know, you can see the way we saw the world and the way we see the world and, you know, the relationships and the evolution there. And to me, that was a really important reminder because I asked myself the same question too, you know, like, we're busy and we all have different skills and different things. You know, if language feels like just kind of vocabulary, it does feel kind of like a sideshow or not super relevant. But then when you think about the other parts of language, the culture, and also being in community with other Wampanoag people, learning the language together and understanding the way we see the world and our relationships with each other and the land, then I think you see why language is so central. And there's no way of separating these things. And so, you know, one of the quotes in the book, I'm paraphrasing, but he says something like, you know, losing the language is like losing the land. And, you know, bringing back the language is like protecting the land. And so all these things that he's trying to do, and I think broadly we're trying to do, it's all wrapped up, and language is one of those means we have of doing that. And I think that is also one of the lessons too, is like there are all these ways to do it, and I don't know that one way is better or more important, but they're all there for us, and I think we have to do all of them.
I appreciate that answer a lot, because within our own language, it really is parallel to that. And even when you talk about the land in Wampanoag, it's literally it's called an inalienable right, which is something that is not separate from ourselves. And so when we talk about the land and the water here, at least in Wampanoag country, it's the same as we are. So I appreciated that parallel with Kotaro and everything that you brought to light with that. If I'm just going to put it out there again, if anybody wants to ask a question to Joseph, now would be a good time to line up. I'm probably going to ask him another question before I open up the mic, if you want to line up right behind. Last question from me. What would your advice be to somebody who is looking to delve into their own identity, and even maybe Wampanoag kids, especially for this book in particular?
I would say two things. One is, as much as possible, try to figure it out for yourself and not let it be determined by, like, you know, what, for me, it was like what education and media and other things that I saw, or what the federal government says. You know, Native identity is one of the sort of few identities very regulated by like federal and state governments. So as much as possible, try not to let those external forces, you know, whoever you are. But the other thing I would say is, you know, talk to people. It's not just you. It's a community identity, I think. And, you know, especially, you know, talk to elders and people who've been around longer, and make sure that those histories are passed along and not lost, and go back through the records and, you know, use every resource available, because those things don't last forever. And, you know, we have them now, and what we have now, I think we have to use.
Thank you for that. Looks like we have a few people. Just a reminder, we're going to ask you to keep the question brief. No speeches, right? No speeches, no soliloquies, okay? So if you want to come up, you can ask your question. Can I pull this down a little bit? Can they pull it down if they need to? Okay. I'm not, I don't know.
That works. Hi. Thanks for coming. Can you all hear me? Kind of hear me? Okay. You mentioned bloodlines. And that's interesting to me. We've done some research in our family for the DAR, where you have to prove through bloodlines or through documentation that you are really related, connected to a person who might have fought in the Revolutionary War. Is there any organization or something like this that you have to document that you are Indigenous?
For us, every tribe has their own policy and guidelines. So for Aquinnah Wampanoag, we have a 19th century census document, essentially, that you have to be able to document that your ancestors on that list identified as Wampanoag. But different tribes, like the Karuk, who I was mentioning with the blood quantum, they'll have a requirement that you have to be 1/4 or 1/8 from that tribe and, you know, be able to document that. And so every tribe has their own policy. So there's not like a centralized system or database or keeper, but it's every tribe has their own policy and means of kind of managing that.
Okay, and do you have to prove with actual documents? You have to bring a birth certificate or just telling them works?
Most of the time you have to have the documentation, yeah.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hi. So this is a question about data, which I think as a journalist who has covered this beat and also on your journey of talking to communities for your book, I'm really curious your perspective on the power of possessing your own rights to data. From what I've learned, there's a lot of sensitivities around, for example, I'm sure imagery. If there's certain areas that a Native community would want to keep obscured and sacred and not accessible from imagery, or if certain things have to remain on the land, do you need a server of data to remain on Native land to consider it possessed by Native communities? And I think that as we all lose control and power of our own privacy and data, I'm wondering in particular the implications for Native communities of maybe not having that possession in a way that's problematic for all of us, probably.
Yeah, it's a great question, and you see it actually relates to the previous question. You're seeing this with DNA testing and, you know, biological data and DNA information, and there are a couple great researchers and organizations working in this space. There's a group called Native Biodata, and they're the first Native-run biobank located on sovereign indigenous lands in the U.S. So that's a really cool organization, and they're trying, you know, because this data and information is useful for medical purposes, for cultural purposes, but it's so often been exploited, and so now they've created this space where tribes can use them as a safe kind of repository, and information can stay there, it can be used, it can come out, or they can decide if a researcher is interested, you know, can I access this data? And so, you know, that's an example. But yeah, in terms of photos and other stuff, I think, you know, as a journalist, I actually have a friend, Toasty Oster, who's an Indigenous Affairs reporter at High Country News, and they wrote this really great essay in companion with a reported piece they did that was like describing the sort of weirdness and tension of being a Native reporter and then being shown sacred spaces, and then like how much of that do you put in the reporting? So at High Country News, Toasty Oster, I encourage people to check that out. But yeah, I think there's like not an answer, but it's just this ongoing question of like case by case, how do you deal with it? And I think some of these people are providing some interesting ways forward. But yeah, the question of data is a big one, and we could talk more about that.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much.
We have 5 minutes left, so the questions, just try to keep them brief so we can get through the rest of you guys.
Yes. I would like you to comment about your experience interviewing Native people who do not live in a Native community or in reservations, and the fact that so many Native Americans are interspersed in our population throughout the city, throughout our cities, and their issues with identity and how people perceive them.
It's a really good question, and one of the reasons I wanted to write the book, because I don't live here full time, and most of the Wampanoag folks don't live on Martha's Vineyard full time, and a lot of the people I did interview are people who, like, I went to their homelands and interviewed them there, but also a lot of the people I talked to are not there, and we connected in other places or other ways, and it was really important for me to do that, to capture that, because I think a lot of people assume that if you don't live on the land in some way, you're not native or you're less native. I think there's so many ways that being native exists. And, I live in New York City, and there's actually, I think it's like there are more natives in New York City than anywhere else in the country, which is surprising to some people. And, walking around, you wouldn't necessarily know that, but there are all these vibrant, community groups. We did an event the other week with the American Indian Community House, which is like 60 plus years old, in New York City, serving the urban indigenous community. There's this new shop, Relative Arts, that I got to do a question and answer piece with, that's, bringing Native artists to New York City. And so, yeah, to your question, I think this is all part of the Native experience, and it's important to show that diversity. And, that's why I wanted to do that in the book. And so the experience for me was, I think, really good, because I'm able to relate to these people, and we're able to talk about that shared experience.
We are out of time, or 3 more minutes, so we can take, both of you, if you can make it quick. Okay.
Hi. So in your chapter about the Onassis property, you talk about how the land bank and how it operates on the island is kind of an example about how there is a system that exists that could facilitate like Wampanoag land reclamation, but it benefits the land bank. It doesn't benefit the Wampanoags. And I'm wondering, is there any systems like in your reporting that do operate like the land bank but facilitate land reclamation? And do you see like a future on the island here where all of our conservation organizations could or would like include Wampanoag land back claims in their conservation efforts?
Yeah, I don't include any of them specifically in the book, but there are, I would have to think and maybe get back to you on, but there are examples of like counties and towns and municipalities that do have some sort of like communal fund or tax thing that helps to fund the tribal land efforts in the area, which, I mean, I think it would be great. But it's really rare. It's really rare. And sometimes one of the other things about land back is it tends to be on an individualized basis, because there's not a central, like the states do not want to give land back. The federal government does not want to give land back. Sometimes you might get a nice person who's like, maybe. There's actually one example of a guy, I think in Utah, who bought a piece of land, and then he's walking around and he found like some ancient things. And he was like, oh, this belongs to a tribe. And like 2 years later, he gave it back. So like it can happen, but it takes that, and to what you're talking about, this sort of more institutionalized like funding, I think it's really hard. And as for if I think it's going to happen here, it's not up to me, but I would like to see it.
We have
no time. I know. 2 quick questions. How hard was it to get the book? Okay, how hard was it to get the book published?
Not that hard, I guess. I was fortunate. I met my editor, and she was really interested in the idea, and I think in many ways it was the kind of book she had been looking for, and we had a very similar shared vision, and so we connected, and it was great.
My other question was whether you're going to raise your kids like you were raised, but
find me in the signing line.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you, Joseph.
Thank you.
If you don't have a copy, pick it up at the book
Go to the book sales tent and see Joseph at the book signing tent. Thank you both very much. That was excellent. Wampanoag tribe, excellent. Thank you.